Welcome back. Brian Claypool is with me via FaceTime. Brian, I want to talk about that last story, the killing of the unarmed teenager Antwon Rose. Right now, protests are continuing at this minute outside of Pittsburgh police stations. Obviously, a lot of anger over this, a lot of reaction from the community. When you hear the details of this case, this 17-year-old boy shot while running from police, unarmed, apparently an honor student, a relatively good reputation in the community. What is your reaction just from the get-go of the circumstances, and also the fact that we know that the officer involved had only been sworn in hours ago and had only been with the Pittsburgh Police Department for 3 weeks?
My visceral reaction is shock and outrage. This reminds me of that recent shooting death, I believe in March, of that young man, Stephen Clark in Sacramento. He was even shot in the back, and he was unarmed. Another African-American young man killed, and there's similarities, Stacy, in both those cases. Let's talk about it. And by the way, I've done plenty of civil rights cases as well involving police shooting and excessive force involving the death of young people. And the common thread in both of those cases is just a flat-out colossal failure of proper police protocol. What this police officer should have done in Pittsburgh, much like the guy in Sacramento, the cop in Sacramento, is pursue the suspect, call for backup, and then try to set up a perimeter around where the suspect is. You don't chase a suspect down like an animal and shoot him like you're hunting in the forest. Once you set up a perimeter, then you're supposed to engage the suspect, talk to him, say, hey, put your hands up. This is the police. You need to surrender. Have a discussion with the suspect. And that never happened here, by the way. But what's most troubling about the Antwon Rose shooting death is that he clearly did not pose an immediate, here's the standard, it has to be an immediate risk of grave bodily harm to the police officer. So what, if anything, did Antwon Rose do to create this sense of immediate, grave, serious harm to the police officer? I haven't seen any evidence. If he's running away, there's actually absolutely no legal justification to use lethal force. Remember, Stacy, lethal force is the last resort of force that a police officer should use. And if there's any case in this country that should warrant criminal prosecution of a police officer, it's this one, because you raised a great point. This cop had barely been sworn in. So what kind of training had he received to handle a situation like this? We can't have people dying because police officers aren't properly trained.
And I want to add a little bit more detail, Brian, and that is that Allegheny County Police in Pennsylvania, in the area where this happened, the superintendent, Coleman McDonough, has been commenting on the case. He said yesterday that under Pennsylvania law, there are circumstances that permit officers to use lethal force on a fleeing suspect. It is allowed to prevent death or serious injury to an officer or another person if the suspect has used or threatened violence or possesses a lethal weapon. But to your point, there is no indication that Antwon Rose threatened violence or was, waving around a gun or anything like that. In fact, we know he was not armed.
Stacey, that's the Pennsylvania law mirrors the federal law. That's the fleeing felon rule. So it's really no different than the standard I just told you, which is the federal standard. And you just made a great point, which is even if they want to invoke the Pennsylvania law standard or exemption, as they call it, it doesn't apply here. Because A, Antwon Rose wasn't posing any threat of harm to anybody else. There's no evidence that he carjacked somebody, that he broke into somebody's house, grabbed a knife and was threatening them. Similarly, there's no evidence that Antwon Rose posed any risk of harm to the police officer. If you're fleeing a police officer, how can you pose a risk of harm to that police officer? And more importantly, Antwon Rose didn't have a weapon. So what's he going to do? How's he going to hurt the police officer? And he wasn't charging at the police officer. So those two exemptions aren't going to apply. And the state attorney general or state prosecutor in Allegheny County better look really carefully at this case to think about, filing charges against this officer for at minimally at minimally negligent homicide.
You know, Brian, I think one of the things that's most frustrating in cases like this, having covered the death of Eric Garner here in New York, for example, hearing about these cases all over the country, Michael Brown, is you say, you know, it seems like an arrest here or charges are justified, but it seems to take so long in these police investigation cases. There has to be the internal investigation, right? Then I guess the prosecutor has to decide if they're going to recuse themselves or bring in an outside prosecutor. So in one sense, you make it seem like it could be so straightforward. Let's arrest this officer and charge him, but usually in these police-involved shooting cases, it takes a really long time. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I've done over a dozen of these cases, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I represented a young man named Doug Zerbe in Long Beach, California. He was shot and killed by the Long Beach Police Department. He had a water nozzle. He was drunk. It was Super Bowl Sunday. He had a water nozzle in his hand. He was waiting for a friend to show up at his friend's apartment. So he was sitting on a balcony, fiddling around with a water nozzle. Neighbor calls police, says, "Hey, I think this guy's got a gun. Come over." All these cops show up. Long story short, they end up shooting him 12 times, killing him. The father of a 4-year-old. We filed a civil wrongful death case. We won a federal jury trial of $4.5 million for the little boy. But getting back to your point in that case, Stacey, I had to file a motion in court to force the LA County Sheriff's Department to finish its investigation. It took over a year, and we couldn't even move forward with the civil case until we got the investigative file from the underlying investigation. And in my opinion, a lot of times in these cases, they intentionally drag their feet. Why? Because they want to give a public perception or create this persona in the court of public opinion that, hey, we're really doing this copious investigation. We got a lot of stuff to do. We got to do forensic testing and do all these interviews. And we want to be really careful about this. But guess what? 99.9% of the time, what's their verdict? We're not going to prosecute.
Right. And you know, while you say, oh, they want to give the impression of doing this really, you know, intense and cross every T, dot every I investigation, that doesn't do anything to calm the frustrations and the anger of the community. I mentioned it at the beginning when we started talking about this story, but right now, as we speak, there's a huge protest going on outside the Pittsburgh Police Department. I'm looking on Twitter and looking at photos and seeing huge crowds outside. So it seems like this is just the beginning as they begin what I'm sure will be a long and arduous investigation into the officer. And one other point I want to touch on, Brian, is the Rose family already has an attorney, no surprise there. And that attorney obviously has said basically what you said. There appears to be absolutely no justification for this. And he says it's worth noting the driver of the car. So let's just recap the facts as we know them pretty quickly. Police got a call of some sort of drive-by shooting. Witnesses gave the identification or a vehicle description, rather, a silver car. Police then pull over this silver Chevy Cruze, which they believe could be the car involved in the drive-by shooting. They arrest the driver. As they're cuffing the driver, Antoine Rose and another guy flee from the car. Antoine Rose is shot when he's fleeing. Well, Rose's family's defense attorney says it's worth noting while the driver of the car he was with was cuffed and taken into custody, he was released from custody. They didn't even have enough evidence to hold him in this drive-by shooting case. What does that say to you? He says, you know, it's significant to note they got the wrong guys to begin with, it seems.
That I didn't even know that. That's a very important point, because what Antoine Rose's lawyer is arguing is powerful. He's saying that the police didn't even have probable cause to pull over this car, that they had false information or incorrect information. They handcuff the wrong suspect. He's not even arrested. And that's going to fuel the fire. That's going to build the flame of outrage, because why were these young men pulled over in the first place? So that's a probable cause issue. And potentially, I'm not saying I don't have evidence of it, potentially a racial profiling issue as well as to why they were pulled over. But Stacey, if I could make one more point on this. Everybody should remember, police officers go through a training academy. They are taught how to handle suspects fleeing. So like when you and I and your viewers see somebody running from the police, sometimes their reaction is, well, you should always comply with a police officer. And because you didn't, you're getting yourself in trouble and you're risking your life. Well, I get that on the surface, but here, the police officers are different than you and I. They are trained to handle these situations. They are trained to expect that suspects might flee. There's a myriad of reasons why people flee from police officers. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they've got an outstanding warrant. They don't want to get arrested and go to jail for that. Maybe they've got a little bit of drugs in their pocket. They're not all murderers. But I think that's a very important point to realize. This was not a split-second decision. Lethal force is to be used when an officer has to make a split-second decision between life and death. That didn't take place here.
Brian, thanks for your analysis on that, and I think this is just the very beginning of what we will hear. Protests, of course, continue in Pittsburgh, and I will not be surprised if they spread nationwide as anger mounts over this killing of this unarmed black man.